My name is Jeanette Mancia Martinez, and I am so excited to welcome you to our very last Peabody Research Spotlight, but just for the academic year, not ever. And I'm really excited to introduce our wonderful panelists momentarily. The session for this afternoon, early evening, is Research in a Global Pandemic, and I think it could not be more timely, unfortunately. And I hope that it's going to be of great interest to everyone. But before I get started, I wanted to give you a very brief overview of what the purpose of the Peabody Research Spotlight is. And in a nutshell, the idea behind starting this event this academic year is really to showcase the excellent research that's conducted by faculty and students, postdocs at Peabody College across all of our departments. So today you will hear from faculty and postdoc across all 5 Peabody departments, all anchored, as I said, on research in a global pandemic in this context. And so everyone has done a great job of already muting their microphones. So if you can make sure you stay on mute so we can avoid background noise, that'll be great. My doctoral student, Min, has been gracious to agree to monitor the chat box. So after you hear from each of the 5 presenters today, this is the order of presentations that we have. We're going to start off with Dr. SOLIZ, followed by Dr. Brady. Then third is Dr. Perkins. Fourth, Dr. Biggs, and last but not least, we will be hearing from Dr. Yamasaki, who has been working with Dr. James Booth. And so following each presentation, which will be about 5 to 7 minutes each, you will have a chance to ask some questions and engage with our presenters, roughly 2 to 3 minutes. So what we really ask you to do is just post your comments or questions directly into the chat box. Min will monitor those and pose those questions afterwards. If we don't get to yours, we will make sure that they get to the presenter, so do not worry. So I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we're gonna kick it off with Dr. SOLIZ.
Thank you, Janet, for inviting me. I've really enjoyed these research spotlights this semester, so I'm really excited to get to be part of this last one. So hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to see us here at the end of the semester. I know everybody is stressed and tired. My name is ADELA, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education and public policy in the LPO department. Next slide, please. Before talking about how the COVID pandemic has affected some of my research, I thought I should tell you about the motivation for my research agenda and also some general, just to give you an overview of my research agenda. So my research questions developed out of my experience teaching in New York City, primarily at Kingsborough Community College. I was a developmental English instructor there, and I taught in an intensive program where I had the same students all day, every day for an entire semester. So with that model, I really got to know my students, and I tried to help them. I ended up helping them navigate sort of all the bureaucracies that are part of higher education. So figuring out how to get out of this dev ed system, figuring out how to fill out their FAFSA and apply for federal financial aid. And all of those experiences made me want to learn more about higher education policy and hopefully to find some way to impact higher education policy and make things better for students like the ones that I was working with at Kingsborough. So I decided to go and get my doctorate at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I was trained primarily by economists. As a result, most of my research is quantitative in nature, but though that's still true, I'm widening my gaze and becoming increasingly interested in using other types of data, asking other types of questions, and sort of learning more about the how and why behind the types of impact estimates that I get from the causal methods that I was trained in. And then also, I've sort of over my years here become more and more convinced that it's essential to be collaborating with education partners when doing research, policy research, if I want my research to have impact. That wasn't an experience that I got to have as a graduate student, but I've been very engaged with city and state policymakers in these early years of my career. Next slide, please. So as I've sort of been talking about indirectly, my research is motivated by my desire to learn how we can improve post-secondary and workforce-related outcomes for underserved students. And I'm particularly focused on students who start or who are enrolled in community colleges. So that's my overarching question. And then all of my projects fit into 3 buckets, I would say. The first is trying to understand the transfer pipeline. So understanding how to improve the probability that a student who starts at a community college and wants a bachelor's degree will be able to transfer to a 4-year college or university. And I have projects studying state policy and also studying student perspectives on the transfer pipeline. My next bucket is college affordability. The study I'm going to talk about related to COVID is an evaluation of the federal work study program. I also have some work looking at how financial aid can be used to incentivize adults to return to college. And then finally, I'm interested in figuring out how we can make sure that community colleges provide high quality vocational and technical training programs. And I have some work looking at recent state and federal policies and how they have worked to improve vocational training at community colleges. Next slide, please. So I think I'm going to talk basically just about the 3rd main bullet in an effort to stay within the time limit. So as I said, I've become more and more engaged in field work and mixed methods types of studies. And so my biggest project right now is a randomized controlled trial evaluation of the federal work study program. It's really much bigger than that. It has a lot of different components, but it's sort of anchored in this RCT. This work is in collaboration with researchers at the Community College Research Center in New York. City University of New York is our education site. And I should probably also say the work is funded by IES, the WT Grant Foundation, and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So as you can imagine, if campuses have closed down, then your campus-based student employment program is going to be up a creek. So essentially, there is no federal work study program this year on a lot of campuses. Campuses like those of the City University that can't sort of easily pivot to providing students with other types of jobs. So even though we randomized our first cohort into the study last March, right before everything fell apart, we're not going to collect data, or we are, but we've essentially called this first year a pilot year. Since the treatment contrast is all messed up, there's not really a treatment for a lot of students. Needless to say, there's also been a lot less contact with my research team and with our education agency partners. We've also had to, which especially with CUNY, you can imagine is disruptive for the project not to be able to engage face-to-face. We've had to rethink, data collection and other aspects of the study, as I'm sure a lot of my colleagues have as well. So suddenly we're doing interviews over Zoom, trying to do focus groups over Zoom, and figuring out sort of what the trade-offs are of those sort of changes. I would say though that there have also been benefits to the disruption in that we've been forced to slow down and think about our research design maybe more intentionally than we had before. You sort of start to get funding and you've got agreement with your education agency, and the ball starts rolling and things start moving really fast. So this has forced us to pause and reflect, which I think has helped. And because it was going to be such a long-term project anyway, it doesn't actually stress me out that much that we sort of are starting over again this year. So peaks and troughs, and I think I'm going to leave it there. And I'd love to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Dr. SOLIZ. That was wonderful. And I know that we give you very little time. So at least we get a taste of what you're doing, a little partial taste. So thank you so much. That was excellent. And I will let Min take over from here.
Yes, we have our first question for you. How are you and your research team getting ready for research post-COVID to maximize the return to in-person research and make up for the lost person-to-person contact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, my first reaction is sort of flippant, but also completely sincere. That for one thing, we just have our fingers really crossed because CUNY has not said for sure whether they're going to open in the fall or not. And while it doesn't totally freak me out to be sort of 1 year behind, it would totally freak me out to be 2 years behind. So we're really hoping the CUNY opens. And I mean, we've just kind of rethought a lot of our data collection this summer in order to still be trying to make good use of our time, even though we aren't asking exactly the questions that we would have been before. And I actually, even though I think it's been hard to be away from my research team and to be away from CUNY, luckily we had enough of our strong relationships established before this happened that it hasn't been a total disaster. So I think we'll be able to transition back pretty smoothly if CUNY opens.
Thank you. Our second question is, do you foresee incorporating online or virtual tools in your future research now that you've had a chance to try them out?
Yeah, that is also an excellent question. And I'm interested too. I hope my colleagues reflect on that as well. I think probably, you know, just sort of as I think a lot of us have found with work, in some ways, I think it might be easier to get people to come to a focus group if they don't have to travel to it. But then, you know, the trade-off is sort of maybe less communication overall if you're not able to sort of read people's facial expressions and body language as much. So I think I will continue to use online tools, but you know, it'd be nice if there could be more of a mix and sort of intentionality. I can interview campus-based administrators without feeling like I'm losing a lot of communication. On the other hand, it's really hard to hold a focus group with students and not feel like you're online and not feel like you're losing a lot that you would have had in person.
Thank you so much. I know there are more questions and we will make sure that you get them, Dr. Solis. But just in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the second presenter. And who knows, at the end, depending on how it goes, we might have time for a little bit more Q&A. So thanks so much. And we are going to move forward with Dr. Corey Brady.
Thank you, Jeanette. And thanks everybody for coming. I know it's a crazy time. Thanks, Min, for the help, and to all the colleagues who are sharing their work in this crazy time. So I thought about kind of just directly how my research has gotten pivoted, or how I've had to pivot to go forward. Jeanette, you can go forward one. But I guess I thought it might be good to give you a sense of how I come at learning and design. By the way, I'm an assistant professor in teaching and learning, and I study mathematical and computational thinking in the context of groups usually. So the thing that I think is distinctive about how I come at that context is by foregrounding the group. So what can we accomplish in groups that we can't accomplish individually? And Jenna, if you go forward, the picture that's going to show up is, because I think people think in images, this image showed up as a gateway ad when I was just deciding that technology and education was an intersection that I cared about. And I mention it because it is, to me, it was a very powerful dystopian picture, like what people seem to mean. In fact, some marketing person spent a lot of time thinking this was a good idea about what the future of education could be and what learning looks like when it's mediated by technology. Whenever I've shown, like every time I look back at this, I get chills again. And when I show it to teachers, it's remarkable how the physical and audible responses that people give to like how isolating technology can be. So I thought back about this again because Zoom sort of feels like another variant of this, and sort of so the question is, when faced with this again, how did I respond? So if you want to go forward. So given that I'm interested in how groups are learning resources together, how learning happens reciprocally in a collaborative group, my research is always in context. So it always matters that which particular group it is, who shows up today, and what decisions the facilitators make to promote certain kinds of interaction. So I study learning at the intersection of these three kinds of things. So classroom culture and the norms of interaction, practices of mathematics and science that are at issue, and the things that I control directly, the learning environments that I and teacher partners bring to bear to enable collective activity to happen. So if you go forward, so given that, you can imagine, so the first thing that happened in the beginning of March was my house got hit by a tornado. And then the second thing that happened was everything shut down. So I had 4 NSF projects that were actively planning to do classroom research. In fact, I was traveling during the tornado for one of them. And all of that changed, right? So the question wasn't like, this was like really reducing to lower levels of the Maslow's pyramid of like, well, how am I gonna live, let alone how am I gonna continue research questions? But like, I think always situations like that get you thinking about kind of what ADELA mentioned, the benefit of a pandemic being this, that they make you question fundamental things. And questioning fundamental things is an important aspect of education research. So I think that what's been most successful for me is thinking about how I can stay true to a mission by adapting to circumstance. And I think that's actually an important, like, phrase that way. It actually is an important kind of learning, a piece of or form of learning. So if you go forward one. I thought about three pivots, and I won't go, well, I will, yeah. We'll see if I have time. The first is taking the kind of learning that's happened in the last year as itself a new kind of learning environment to look at. So thinking about how things that are showing up through the creativity of students and teacher partners and my own kind of back to the wall creativity, how those might actually reveal things about how people learn in general and how people can learn with technology mediation. And then second, thinking about how the change in dynamics of everybody's work life makes some things harder, but makes some things easier, or makes some things center some things, some kinds of partnership as necessary for solidarity. And then the third, responding to things that are happening in our very dynamic and changing environment that enable lines of inquiry to go forward, which otherwise would have been stopped. So I'll briefly talk about each of those. So the first, yeah, if you go forward. The first is, and click one more. So like comparing that image from the gateway ad to what it looks like in Zoom settings. I think there's a lot of possibility in thinking about the space of a Zoom meeting as a space. So what's happening here is kids contending with the mathematical idea of topology, of the shape of space, and imagining what would happen if your world, if the left-hand side of your world was connected to your right-hand side. So if you thought about the geometry that you learned in high school, where the piece of paper, the right-hand side of the piece of paper is an edge to the world. What if that was sewn around to the left-hand side of the piece of paper, making a cylinder? And so what would it be like to pass an object? What's happening and when we go off to the left and come back to the right, was sort of the students becoming the space they were studying. And this is an elementary one, so cylinders, but we explored more exotic spaces in that class. So there's a lot of creativity that happens with playing with the medium, especially when it's felt as a hardship. So if you go forward. I'll pass through this, except just to say that we feel like we're under stress, but that sometimes makes partnerships all the more important. So I'll take the second one, where it's been an occasion to work with artists who depend on physical presence and now are out of a job, to think about how partnerships with research can keep collaborations alive and support people as they have differential suffering in the pandemic. The first bullet was that international collaborations have blossomed because it's easier to collaborate internationally now. And so if you go to the last one, I just wanted to mention we received in the middle of the kind of tumult of the pandemic data that showed how we had pretty strong systemic inequities in how we're dealing with undergraduate education. And that felt like an opportunity for partnership across the street between Peabody and Arts and Science. And so that's launched my taking a secondary appointment in mathematics and teaching a course this spring with the goal of understanding as a partner the problems that are happening in particular in the math department. And then the last bit, we have opportunities that align with strategic initiatives that are exciting ways to build new links across the university. So pivoting has been, it turns out, it's hard work, but it's turned out to enable things to go forward by going sideways and then forward.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was great. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Min, who probably has some questions that have come in for you. Thank you.
Yep, I sure do. First question for you is, what strategies would you recommend to teachers or teacher educators trying to create a culture of dialogic interaction that's so important for learning and instruction in this virtual space?
Yeah, I had an answer. So one of the things that that happened. So this calculus course that I've taught has 44 students in it in an environment that only allows 13 at a time. So we've got people that are in other countries that have 2/3 of the class remote. And my answer to that question is very different, having done it, than it was in the fall when I was advising people in Dixon County in their algebra class who were dealing with the same things that I didn't have personal experience empathizing with. And so I think the advice, the on the paper advice, is the same, but the feeling behind it is different and deeper now that I've kind of been in their shoes. And what I've noted is it's all the more important. I think this is true always, but it's all the more important to recognize that that there are different perspectives in the room. That the way that you perceive the class as a teacher is not the same as the way the students perceive the class as students. And I think we can believe that we empathize with students when we're in the physical room, but talking to students who are in China and only see each other, only see faces of other students in breakout rooms when students turn their cameras on, is just like an example of a perspective on learning that I didn't have because I started thinking about the classroom as just another classroom with an accommodation over Zoom. But it's a totally different experience. And so trying to taking the difference seriously and the difference as it impacts students' well-being and their emotional state is super important.
Thank you so much. The second question is, what are some of the largest changes in engagement with students pre and during the pandemic that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think that people. I was talking to a mentor who was talking about hardships in teaching, and in some sense, hardships are an opportunity for communities to come together in ways that they wouldn't under the best conditions, right? So so the case he was talking about was he was assigned a room. He was assigned 2 rooms for a class that were not contiguous. This was in a place that usually they have a partition between rooms, but through a mistake, the 2 rooms were across the hall. So he had one class in 2 rooms, couldn't be physically in the same room for more than half of the time, and the evaluations were better than he'd ever had. So that only happens because students recognized that this was a terrible situation and decided to make the class wonderful. And I think this happens this can happen if we share the fact that this is like we don't pretend that this is that we know how to handle this situation, and we share the problems of teaching and learning with students. I think people respond better than I would have otherwise guessed. It's not our responsibility entirely to make it an optimal learning environment. We can turn that over.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. That was really wonderful. And we're going to move forward with our third presenter for today, and that would be Dr. Jessica Perkins.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for coming today at the end of the day on a Thursday. I know we all appreciate you staying in there until 5 p.m. or so. I am an assistant professor in human and organizational development, and by training, I'm a social and behavioral scientist with a background in global public health. So I do a lot of work focused around community-based interventions, trying to promote health and wellness among vulnerable communities. And I focus a lot of my work in Africa. Today, I'll give you a brief overview of my research, which focuses on social predictors of why humans do what they do. Now, there are a lot of factors, obviously, that play into that. And I'm particularly interested in the role of social networks, social norms, and social contexts. And I will tell you about that now. Next slide, please. So a mentor once told me that you have to specialize in something. You got to make yourself become an expert. And this was a piece of advice that I got at some point along my graduate school training. And he said, you need to pick an exposure or a population or a place or an outcome, like something that people will learn to associate with you. Because my interests spanned a lot of topics and I wasn't ready to narrowly focus on, let's say, just HIV, for example, or just educational outcomes among youth, for example, I ended up thinking about the role of exposures in our life. And so specifically, again, that's on networks, norms, and context. So over the last many years, I've looked at health, and now being in a College of Education and Human Development, I've now started to expand to think about how networks and norms and our social context more widely impact our academic outcomes, our sense of empowerment, our engagement in social justice related activities. To briefly tell you what I mean by networks, because there's a lot of definitions of networks and norms out there. By network, I mean the person-to-person interaction. So that, of course, has been impacted by COVID. I am curious to see how a lot of the work that I've done before may or may not be impacted by the change in people's social networks over the last 12 years. And because I've been collecting data before, during, and after, hopefully I'll be able to look at how changes in social networks impact our health and well-being in the context of a global pandemic. When I'm thinking about networks, again, I mean, it could be like your direct ties to friends, family, neighbors, but we also are embedded in these much larger networks that we don't even see. So for example, your friends of a colleague, of a neighbor, of a family member, their, whether they got COVID or their behaviors around COVID or their thoughts on COVID, those kinds of things flow through a network, even though we are not at all aware of that. And that's become especially something that I think about all the time. I can't help but think about sort of like the invisible ties between people now, that we have been living in this pandemic where something spreads, an infectious disease spreads so easily. In terms of norms, there's been a lot of research showing that humans are motivated to do what they think others are doing. So what we perceive to be typical and common behaviors impact our own decisions to engage or not in behaviors. And so again, for example, if we think most people are hand washing, or most people are wearing a mask, or most people are going to go get a vaccine, we're probably a lot more likely to go do those things ourselves, as opposed to if we thought nobody was doing it, we're much less likely to do it. The interesting part, the research question there that I'm interested in is asking, well, to what extent do our perceptions match what actually happens in reality among our social networks? And there's been a lot of work looking at, well, people tend to think risk behaviors are much more common than they are. So not wearing a mask or not getting vaccinated. And people think that health promoting behaviors are very rare. Now, here in the state of Tennessee, where a vaccine rollout has not gone as well as hoped, these present some interesting research questions to begin exploring. And then social context. So it's also really important to think about where people are situated. So where are these networks? Where are these norms? And what kind of cultural context, what kind of policies and regulations? Because those sort of overarching infrastructures will for sure impact the kinds of social networks that people are embedded in and the perceptions of social norms that they form. Next slide. So I was thinking about what to talk about in terms of how my research has been impacted by COVID. And honestly, it's the kinds of conversations that I had with people every day. People hear that I study these kinds of things and they're like, oh, so this is what you do, COVID. And I'm like, yes, this is what I do. And yet at the same time, it's also slowed down a lot of what I do. I work in Uganda and I haven't been there in 15 months. We haven't seen anybody in person in 15 months. We do constant data collection among 2,000 adults in person. We've had to switch that over to working over the phone. And surprisingly, we've actually been able to collect a lot of data that way, but it's a lot more slow going. And, we don't know to what extent this is affecting the kinds of data we're collecting, but hopefully we'll be able to see how the social networks in Uganda impact how people are engaging in with each other in these kinds of very rural, low resource contexts where social connections was like the primary means of facilitating food exchange and financial exchange and accessing a wide variety of resources. Because some of that work has slowed down, I also started picking up some work in thinking about social norms and social networks among college students here at Vanderbilt. So along with some students of mine, undergrads and master's and PhD students, we have been looking at behavior before the pandemic, and we are gearing up to send out a survey, this coming fall, and to look at how people's perceptions of norms and how their social networks have changed. So one thing I've learned in this pandemic is really just trying to be as flexible as possible in the ways that we can collect data and also try to anticipate how some of our outcomes might be changing. Next slide. So this is just a brief overview of some work that I've done in Uganda. So for example, in Uganda, people tend to think that HIV prevention behaviors are not common at all. They think nobody gets tested for HIV, and yet most people are. And same thing with substance use. People think that most men are getting intoxicated every night of the week. It's very similar to college students' perceptions here on the Vanderbilt campus. And yet that's not actually true. And so I've been finding these kinds of similar phenomena around risk behavior there. And now we're starting to think about that in the context of COVID. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of how I've been widening my set of outcome interest beyond the health arena, in working with students here at Vanderbilt, we've started to look at, well, what are undergraduates' thoughts around accessing mental health treatment, accessing support for alcohol use. And particularly, we've been interested in the context of the pandemic, where we know that more and more students have been struggling with a lot of substance use and mental health related challenges. We've been looking at their perceptions of stigma. Do their peers hold stigmatizing attitudes? And, while a lot of people say they would personally support people going and, be happy to talk about these kinds of things if someone wanted to talk to them about it, they also fear that many more of their peers actually do hold stigmatizing attitudes than in reality. And so we've been talking about some interventions opportunities there and how to have some conversations with folks in the administration about our findings in these kinds of studies. I have no idea how much time it's been, so I don't know how much I have left, but next slide, I'm happy to talk about any of these topics further. I think I talked about this one already when I was talking about Uganda. So vaccine rollout in Uganda has been really slow. Like, even people in our research group, I work with a large research team over there. We have, data analysts and research assistants and whatnot. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy even among, our research group. And so not only have we been thinking about a lot of these topics and how people's social networks and their perceptions of social norms influence behavior in the populations that we study, we're now taking a step back and saying, all right, well, how are some of these issues arising within our own research infrastructure? And so that's really put another kind of conversation into our weekly Skype calls. Next slide. All right, so in thinking about the slowed down nature of global research, so in some sense, it's like easier because we're all using more technology to connect with people. And yet, especially if you're working in areas where the internet is spotty, it's not actually easy to do Zoom-based interviews or Zoom-based focus group discussions. So some aspects of our work just are simply not happening. And so that's made me take a step back and say, okay, well, I think it's actually really important to begin to develop some local projects that might be easier to, in some ways, manage to keep going if people can meet outside or masked in person. Are there ways that I can take some of the work that I've done globally and bring it to Nashville? So I'm really interested in exploring, particularly with colleagues at Peabody, how we can study the role of misperceived norms in trying to promote, interest in taking STEM-oriented classes, and how we can address some of the gun and other kinds of violence issues that we have here in Nashville. I think that might be it. Next slide. My last slide is, I just wanted to put out there that it's become even more critical for my work and also for my own health and well-being in a pandemic to be able to push things forward. Team-based science. It's, I love to work with students. I work with colleagues across multiple institutions and across departments. I work with political scientists and economists and psychiatrists. And that kind of diversity in background has really led to some interesting conversations and perspectives on how can we motivate people to, take vaccines. And so when you're working with such a wide variety of people, I think in moments where your social ties are otherwise cut, it really comes to the forefront how important and supportive those kinds of cross-disciplinary and team-based collaborations can be. So happy to work with anyone.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Perkins. Lots to discuss for sure. So we'll see what Min has for you.
Yep, thank you, Dr. Perkins. Your first question is, now that most communications are virtual, how have you changed your communications process to vulnerable or rural communities who may not have access to internet or virtual tools?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Our team in Uganda used to be in the field all the time, every day, and we can't do that anymore. And so our team has switched to making phone calls, and we didn't think we were going to be able to do that very successfully given spotty reception, and people are just much less likely to pick up phone calls. But we found that because we've been working there so long, that people actually do want to pick up our phone calls, because the people that we work with in these villages, they themselves have had reduced interactions with their own peers. And so they are using the phone more than they ever used to. And so in some sense, we're kind of like going old school a little bit and relying on phone to phone calls, not something that people have been doing, you know, more recently. So, or prior to COVID. So that's one way we've been doing that. And then we have also been figuring out how to have mass, socially distanced, safe gatherings with community leaders, so that we can continue to engage with them on what they think are the priorities for interventions needed in these villages. We've been continuing to engage with them on our next research steps. We always do a lot of community sensitization and mobilization, and we're just having to be creative in terms of the numbers of people that we bring together in outdoor kinds of ways.
Thank you, Dr. Perkins. We have one more question for you. In your studies with students at Vanderbilt, how do you think COVID influenced how social networks and norms form among students?
Yeah, so I think the networks were a lot smaller and a lot tighter. And I do think that there was this divide, it seemed, and this is one thing that we're going to study, around students had perceptions of what students on campus, their typical behaviors, and then they had perceptions of what students off campus who lived off campus did and their typical behaviors, and they often were quite different. And you know, we don't know which set of perceptions were correct or more or less correct. We don't know, but I do think that there were these sort of more distinct groups around which people formed perceptions, like, oh, like this athletic team or these students that lived off campus. And you know, they say, oh, all those people do those kinds of things, but me and my personal network, we don't do that. And so I think there was probably a lot more opportunity for sort of creating some exaggerated misperceptions about these specific groups.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Perkins. And we're going to move forward with our fourth presenter for today, Dr. Elizabeth Biggs.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk with you. My name is Elizabeth Biggs, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education. Next slide. I wanted to share a little bit about the focus of my work, even prior to the pandemic. So my work focuses on children and youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities who have what's considered to be complex communication needs or augmentative and alternative communication needs. So estimates of the prevalence of these children are sort of hard to come by because definitions of who has complex communication needs are quite varied, but somewhere around 1 in every 150 children here in the United States, and approximately the same or sometimes more in other areas of the world, have such significant communication impairments that these children really aren't able to meet their daily communication needs through verbal speech. So these include kids who might be termed nonverbal in the true sense of the word, meaning they don't use any spoken words. But these also include kids who use some spoken words, but perhaps their intelligibility is so poor that their communication with unfamiliar people in their environments is not effective. Or who have some words but aren't able to use them as functionally to meet their daily communication needs. So even though this is a somewhat small group of children, it's a remarkably heterogeneous group of children. It includes kids with diagnoses such as autism spectrum disorder, where about a third of children with autism remain minimally verbal or have these AAC needs long into their school years and adulthood. Children with Down syndrome, other genetic syndromes and disorders, children with cerebral palsy. These are examples of some of the different types of etiologies that can create the need for these supports. The term AAC itself actually refers to the supports. So these refer to other means to supplement or replace the use of verbal speech to communicate when children or youth or adults, for that matter, have complex communication needs. And you can think about this as a big umbrella term that includes both unaided forms of AAC, which simply means you don't need anything else other than your body to use them. So gestures, non-word vocalizations, manual signs like ASL, And then aided AAC, which refers to the use of external tools to communicate, most often either picture symbols, literally printed, perhaps laminated as single icons or on a larger board, or higher tech speech generating devices, like you can sort of see a small icon here on this page. Next slide. So there's a lot of key challenges to serving these children and youth who have AAC needs. And I came into this interest in research through a really practical lens. So I was a special education teacher for several years, actually on the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. And it's a region of our country that's incredibly under-resourced. And actually all of these challenges exist across our country, even in well-resourced areas, but they're magnified tenfold in these communities that are less resourced. And so some of the challenges that really exist to serving kids with disabilities who have AAC needs well exist across these ecological systems, ranging from sort of their microsystems, their home communities, their school communities, their community communities, all the way up through sort of mesosystem interactions, so how home and school communicate or don't communicate. And then sort of those exosystem or macrosystem factors that are much broader and sort of beyond the student themselves. One of the biggest challenges is actually misconceptions about augmentative and alternative communication. So in the general public, there's perceptions that getting kids access to these types of communication devices will prevent them from developing verbal speech. And the research actually couldn't be more clear that the opposite is true. That for children who are having challenges developing spoken language, that the use of these external tools can actually speed along at times the process of developing language and an understanding of how symbols represent ideas. And for some children for whom it's a motor speech type of concern, it's certainly not going to hinder that any more than they would have already had challenges in those areas. So these misconceptions are one of the biggest challenges about serving these children well, but there's a whole host of others too. There's lots of barriers just to getting access to these types of devices. And then once kids have them, they're often underutilized or abandoned altogether because the supports aren't in place. Communicating with AAC is awkward and it's slow. And it's not as fast or quick or easy as spoken languages. And so because of that, when we have limited support networks around families, limited support networks around teachers and service providers, it can be really challenging to know how to serve these children well. And that's under normal sorts of circumstances, even before the pandemic. You also see my note here about constantly changing technology. So certainly advances in technology in recent decades have really opened tremendous doors for communication for these children, but the way that technology is constantly changing makes it even more difficult for service providers, for parents to be able to navigate sort of this constantly changing environment. Next slide. So for me, the COVID pandemic, my biggest pivot was it opened up these really interesting questions that I had never actually thought to consider because they weren't actually questions yet until the pandemic came. And one of those was there had always been this issue around how schools and service providers can better support families in the area of AAC service provision. And with the COVID pandemic, we see sort of these mesosystems coming closer together, right? Home and school are now overlapping much more. Children are learning at home. So in spite of all of the challenges that might come with that, are there ways to leverage what we might learn from this unique context about supporting family school partnerships for these children? Can we leverage something from this unique environment that could have a long-term impact on how we think about supports and service provision for these children? And so I was able to obtain funding from the Spencer Foundation in response to their specific COVID-19 calls to study this and to look at this year. So we've been particularly interested in language and literacy learning as sort of a central pillar for these children. We can help them access language and literacy. We open tremendous doors for other learning and opportunities. So we wanted to know, how are families being supported in this context, both sort of through the school and family school partnerships, but also their broader social networks and informal supports? What impact do these different types of social supports have on the way that they're involved in language and literacy learning in the home, and also their empowerment, both sort of at their family level, so whether they feel self-efficacy about supporting their child's learning, and how they navigate the service system in the school, how they advocate in light of the challenges they're experiencing. And then obviously also connecting these issues with outcomes for children. Next slide. So this study in particular looked like a longitudinal mixed method design. They were actually right in the thick of completing our time 3 data collection for. We had 37 families enrolled, which does not sound like a large number, but for this population, it's quite a large number. So one of the challenges of researching, sort of a rare sort of group of people is access to those people for research. And I'll talk here in a little bit that something about the pandemic actually lessened some of the demands on that and made it easier in some ways to recruit more families because we could leverage technology and therefore expand sort of our geographic base of where we were pulling families from. So I won't spend too much time here simply because we have less time, other than to say this, that the integration of quantitative and qualitative data was really important to me here. Again, my goal was really to leverage learning about what's happening right now so that we could think about how to design and develop better family school partnerships and supports in the future. And so our data involved different types of questionnaires and rating scales, semi-structured interviews all conducted through Zoom, and then observations in the home also conducted through Zoom, specifically during the context of shared reading and some sort of play-based activity for these children who were all elementary aged kids with AAC needs. Next slide. So in addition to that first pressing question that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, I was also interested in some kind of secondary questions that came out of this. One was how service providers were navigating telepractice for this population. Telepractice and teleeducation is clearly complex for everyone, for any population to sort of learn that. But when kids are using external devices to communicate, it kind of multiplies the challenge. And these are also children who are unlikely to be able to navigate the use of technology to learn without an adult being there to support them on their side of the screen. So I did a national survey on AAC telepractice, meaning what are the views and experiences of speech language pathologists who are serving these children related to using telepractice to serve them. And in conjunction with some colleagues at Florida State University, we also conducted about 50 in-depth interviews with parents and speech language pathologists who were serving these children to really ask about the impact of the pandemic on communication-related services and outcomes and what that impact really looks like. Next slide. So what are we learning? I thought about what I was learning in kind of two main areas. The first being for our team. We're learning how to get work done in a really strange environment. And I've seen a lot of benefits of leveraging this technology that's now quite every day, right? Zoom is, at least in most pockets, quite every day. It supported certainly teamwork and collaboration with our team, but also with other researchers, made those collaborations when folks aren't here at Vanderbilt a little bit easier. I mentioned that it's really expanded the geographical region that I can recruit families from, which is quite helpful in the sense that these children are, about 0.5% of the population. And in many ways, it's made for more convenient and less intrusive study participation. So I think for our families who are enrolled in this longitudinal study, if we were requiring families to come to campus, we certainly would have seen attrition. And we actually haven't had any attrition, fingers crossed for time 3, in this study at all. And I think that technology has helped support that. But it doesn't come without challenges. So one of the most difficult things was that I really wanted to figure out how to do a better job recruiting families from diverse backgrounds. But of course, that's challenging. We had an online study and there was no way around that. And so our sample is diverse in some aspects, but not nearly as diverse as I would have liked for it to be. And I think that striving for sort of community on our team has been difficult. Next slide. I'll keep the last one short. So what are we learning? We're learning the good and the bad. I think I expected to learn how challenging this would be for families to navigate supporting their child with a disability through the pandemic. What I didn't expect to see was how many families actually said that they feel more empowered now than they've ever felt before, because they can kind of see into the school and how to support their child more. And similarly, those teachers and service providers are seeing into their home more and are actually able to adapt and make their service provision more appropriate and more individualized for those unique families. But we're also seeing really widening disparities. So when children were already particularly vulnerable to not experience good services, that has worsened. And so these disparities that we already saw in service provision and AAC access are just getting wider and more obvious as the pandemic drives on. What excites me is seeing the potential to sort of reimagine telepractice flexibly, no longer needing it in the future as an all or nothing sort of thing. But what would this look like to really use technology flexibly to support families well and help bridge sort of this tremendous gap between school and home for these children? Next slide. And just a quick shout out and thanks to my wonderful team, students who have worked really hard and made all of this research possible. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Biggs. There is a lot certainly to discuss. And I do want to let everyone know that I'm aware of the time. Hopefully you can hang in there with us because we definitely want to hear from Dr. Yamasaki in just a moment. But we may not have time for too many questions, Dr. Biggs, but Min will send you questions that have come in because there's definitely more than one question. And I encourage participants to reach out directly to our presenters as well. We'll have contact info. So Min.
Yes, thank you. Your question we have for you is, how would you like to see school districts and other outside providers implement better practices for family and school partnerships, especially during COVID times?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've learned along this way is just how valuable it is when providers can do the good family-centered practices that we've known all along to be true. In education, especially in special education at early childhood levels, we talk about family-centered practices all the time, really coming alongside families, providing true coaching and partnership, not just sending information to families home, right, but really coming alongside them and working to figure out how to meet their goals in the home for their child. By the time kids reach kindergarten, for some reason, we seem to forget all of that good stuff and it just goes away. And for kids with really significant disabilities, I think it's become increasingly obvious how much we need family-centered educational and related services for these kids. And so what we would like to see happen is develop models for what does family-centered practice really look like when kids reach school age. It doesn't have to look the same as it would when they're toddlers, but we can still have the same goal of really coming alongside and partnering with individual families, not just shoving information sort of at them and hoping that they pick it up.
Thank you, Dr. Biggs. We will gather all the remaining questions and send them your way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, we are going to hear from Dr. Brianna Yamasaki.
Thank you. And to echo everyone else, thank you everyone for being here. I am a postdoc in the Brain Development Lab, which is run by James Booth. It's in the Psychology and Human Development Department here on the Peabody campus. And I'm going to take an approach that's been slightly different than the other members of the panel and zoom in and really tell you a little bit more specifically about one of the projects we've been working on during this COVID pandemic period. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this project is really aimed at understanding the role of prior knowledge in second language learning. And actually, you can go to the next slide. And it's motivated by this theory of the complementary learning system. So according to this theory, when we learn new information, it goes through kind of two stages. Initially, when the information is novel to us, we see that the information is supported by the hippocampus. This is a subcortical brain structure that's on the side of your brains, and it supports information in kind of a less stable, transient, time-sensitive way. And over time, as we learn that information, we see a transition from the hippocampus to the neocortex, which is kind of the main part of your brain that we think of when we think of the brain. And these neocortical representations are our stable representations. So the information is now learned, it's consolidated, it's integrated with our prior knowledge, it's now in our long-term memory. So according to this theory, information moves through these two different stages. And what's interesting is that the rate at which information moves from this less stable to more stable point actually varies based on your prior knowledge. So if the information that you're trying to learn is consistent with stuff that you already know, we see a faster transition to this more stable, permanent state. And it's these principles of the complementary learning systems theory that we're really interested in looking at within the context of word learning and second language word learning in particular. So you can move to the next slide, please. So specifically in this study, we make the prediction that it's easier to learn words in a second language that are more similar to your native language. And certainly research in the past few decades has provided some behavioral evidence for this prediction. And we're interested in trying to understand what are the neural mechanisms that support this idea of transfer between languages, with the assumption that similarity between your native language and the second language that you're trying to learn represents one form of prior knowledge. So there might be some facilitation from that less stable to more stable or permanent representation of the information. And the way in which these predictions will be brought out, we expect is behaviorally, we would see a faster learning rate. So participants learn words that are more similar to their native language more quickly than words that are dissimilar. Again, that facilitation effect for the prior knowledge. And then neurally, we expect more neocortical recruitment. So for us, that's frontal and temporal regions, which we know support word processing for words that are more similar than dissimilar to your native language. Now, in terms of how we're operationalizing language similarity, our two critical conditions are words that are, of course, similar to participants' native language and dissimilar. For all of our participants, their native language is English. So for the similar words, these are words that are structured with a known structure. So in English, the root suffix pattern is very common. Think about how we add an S to pluralize things or add an ED to say something's in the past tense. So individuals who speak English know this root suffix structure very well. We've integrated this into our artificial second language, and we expect, because this is a known structure, these words will be easier to learn. Alternatively, we have another structure, which I'll call the root pattern structure. This structure is an interleaving of consonants and vowels, essentially. We don't have very many examples of this in English, so this is a structure that's uncommon to native English speakers, but it is common in many other languages like Hebrew or Arabic. So this is a meaningful structure that participants might learn, but because it's not similar to their prior native language known structures, we expect that there'll be more difficulty in learning these words. You can go ahead and move forward. So just briefly, before I talk about some preliminary results, to talk about our challenges related to COVID-19, our biggest one is that this is a neuroimaging study. So we need participants in the scanner in order to get this brain data. So there was no way that we could do this remotely. In addition, a lot of our measures require face-to-face interactions. And of course, as other panelists have kind of outlined already, these could potentially be done in a virtual forum, but because we already needed participants to come in for the scans, we knew we wanted to find a way to safely and effectively communicate with participants in person to reliably get some of the measures that we were interested in. You can go to the next slide, please. So in order to address these challenges, we worked with the university to really figure out what were our protocols, how are we going to be safe in terms of running these tests and getting these scans, but also maintaining the reliability of the measures that we were interested in. So some of the things that we've implemented are socially distanced experimental testing spaces. So in that first picture, you can see some socially distanced desks. So the way that we have it set up is that participants would be seated in the gray chair, experimenter in the green chair, and we maintain this distance as we interact with participants in order to collect the data. We also have separate workstations, so while we're controlling the same computer, we don't ever touch the same equipment. So we've really created distance and barriers in terms of interactions while still being able to maintain data collection in person. We've also implemented the use of face masks and face shields and gloves by all the researchers. Again, because we're in person, we're interacting directly with participants. We wanted to make sure we had those barriers in place so we weren't spreading any germs, COVID-19 or otherwise. And finally, we've implemented some rigorous symptom monitoring. So we ask participants to monitor and fill out surveys for symptoms, as well as researchers 24 hours before every session, as well as at the start of every session. So participants in this study come in for 5 sessions over the course of a couple weeks. And at each stage, we make sure we're monitoring symptoms so that both the participant and the researcher have confirmed that they aren't showing any concerning symptoms. So these solutions have allowed us to resume data collection. Several months into the pandemic, we could start data collection again, and we've been able to collect some preliminary data. And I just want to briefly show you what we've found thus far. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So first, I'm just showing you some learning rate data. So this is learning rate over the course of 12 training sessions over 4 language training sessions. This is accuracy at each session for the similar and dissimilar words. As a reminder, based on our complementary learning systems theories predictions, we expected that the L1 similar words would be easier to learn and participants would learn them faster. You can see that the yellow line representing the similar words is higher than the black line across most of the sessions, as well as it's a little bit harder to see, but it actually is a steeper slope. So behaviorally, we are seeing that in line with our predictions, participants are able to learn these more similar words more quickly. And this is in line with that complementary learning systems theory. And finally, if I could show the next slide, neurobiologically, this is what we're seeing. So here we're just looking at what kind of networks are engaged when participants are processing these words, both early and late in learning. And here what I'm showing you is that both early and late learning across both types of words, we see robust engagement of our regions of interest. So we have those frontal and temporal regions, and then we also have hippocampus, that subcortical region. So participants are engaging the regions that we expect. And as we get our full sample, it'll be really interesting to see if we see transitions and how these regions are recruited over time and in relation to whether or not the words are similar or dissimilar. So that is it. Thank you again, and happy to answer questions about the work or our COVID protocols.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yamasaki. I'm sure there are some questions for you. So let's go ahead and hear from Min.
Yes, definitely. The first question is about the practical implications. Someone asked, what should classroom teachers and bilingual teachers could take away from the findings?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this study thus far has been with adults, but actually recently we've been talking about maybe implications for this type of study with kids. I think one thing that's really important and reflected in both this study as well as work that Dr. Booth and I have done in other projects is that you can't ignore someone's native language, that it plays a role in someone's second language learning and proficiency. So this study suggests that a child might be building off of their native language when they're trying to learn a second language in a classroom setting. And so I think remembering that there is that balance and that the languages interact is really important and reflected in this study, and more practically suggests that when you can make links between an individual's native language and their second language, that might help learning, right? Because if you can help them make that link between their prior knowledge, the things that they know, and the things that they're trying to learn, you might be able to facilitate that learning process. So when possible, making those links explicit could help.
Thank you. There's one more question for you. Could you tell us a little bit about the age of the participants and whether the brain activation pattern would be similar in young children versus adults?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned that these were adults. So these adults are 18 to 35, so young adults. So they are well past the childhood years. We do expect that there would be similarities in some of the brain activation patterns we would see. So the regions that we're focused on are memory-based regions and word processing-based regions. So some of that will be similar between kids and adults. But what's interesting is that the context in which they're learning is different. So if you think about an adult, they already have likely a proficient native language, and they're building off an already established language, and they already have strategies that they've learned over their lifetime in terms of how to learn, how to integrate knowledge. Versus a kid, their native language might be still developing, likely is, and they also have much less experience with strategies on how to learn effectively. So the context in which the learning is occurring is different in kids versus adults. So while similar regions might be recruited, we might see variability because of the context of learning being different between the age groups.
Well, thank you all so much. I apologize that we went over time, but by just a tiny bit, but you hung there with us. I think they were all really fascinating presentations, and we will forward any questions that we were not able to get to, but I strongly encourage participants to please contact the presenters directly. Here are their names and email addresses. I'm sure you can find them easily online. And again, thank you so much for these excellent presentations. This will conclude the last Peabody Research Spotlight for the academic year, but stay tuned because we will resume this in fall, well, really summer, and at some point in August or September. Thank you all and have a great evening and be safe all.